Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Now, as promised and as requested, I am making a video reviewing all of the books I've read in 2020. So if you guys are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Tiana. I basically make videos here on my YouTube channel to kind of document my mission to live consciously, explore and change the world. I am a PhD student. I'm doing my PhD in communications for social change. I am an activist and I run a social enterprise called the Humanitarian Changemakers Network with the goal of equipping and empowering more young people to take action to change the world. Now, I also love reading and I have a whole playlist of book-related videos here on my channel. Obviously, I love learning, and learning is kind of one of those things which is not only essential in life, but especially essential if you are somebody who is working in the social change space. The world is constantly changing and evolving, and as such, our knowledge and understanding of the world and the issues that we work on and our understanding of how we relate to people and things needs to also constantly evolve and change. Now this year I set myself a goal to read about 50 books. I was really hoping I could do about one book a week. Thanks to COVID, I got pretty close to that goal, but I ended up reading a total of 44 books this year, including audiobooks, but not including like academic books that I had to read for my PhD. So I'm pretty happy with 44. Of those 44, I think only about 4 of them were fiction books. So if you are into fiction, you might not vibe with my reading list and my review of these books. But if you're somebody who likes to read non-fiction books like myself, then strap yourselves in because I read some pretty good books this year. I'm not gonna lie. I wanted to create a list of my top 10 books for 2020, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't get down to like my top 10. I just was like, oh, I was like, maybe I'll do a top 20, and I was like, no, because that's like half the books you've read. It was too much. So I'm just gonna go through, I'm gonna basically tell you all the books I read this year, give you a little bit of like my opinion on them, and whether I would recommend reading them or not. So the first book I read, I think I started it just before New Year's, but it was like the first book I finished in 2020. It was called Start Now, Perfect Later. It was a good book. It wasn't anything that was like super revelational. It was basically just a book about the way people like to procrastinate and put off doing things. We basically have this idea that like, oh, I'll start when I'm ready and when I can do it perfectly, and we kind of like to G ourselves up mentally before we do these things. And the author was basically arguing that it's better to just like start things now and then perfect it later. I'll let that plane go past. So yeah, not a very profound concept, but definitely something that I think we can all relate to. We kind of like put off in our heads that like we're not going to start something until we're like we think we're ready to do it and we can do it perfectly, but it's so much better to just like do something imperfectly and then improve it later. I think that particularly kind of relates to like writing. I've always wanted to write a book. I've had this idea for a book for the last like 12 months or so, and it wasn't until like a few months ago that I actually wrote the book. But yeah, it kind of relates to this idea that like it's better to just like write a really rough first draft and then go and make it better, rather than like thinking you need to like G yourself up and like prepare yourself to like produce this perfect thing from the get-go. So good book. Would I recommend it? Maybe if you're a massive procrastinator, yeah. Otherwise, probably not that. Don't add it like to your to-be-read list. This Is Not a Drill, the official Extinction Rebellion handbook. It's basically filled with a bunch of short essays written by different people, like scientists, social scientists. If you're somebody who knows a lot about the climate crisis and climate change, it probably won't be like that profound, but if you're somebody who's kind of just learning about it, it's a really easy read because it is filled with these short kind of like essay pieces. It was really fascinating. I still found it quite confronting, and yeah, it's kind of like a manifesto to what's happening in the world and why we need to take action to demand climate action. Would I recommend This Is Not a Drill? Yes, I probably would, especially if you're somebody who's interested in learning more about the climate crisis, although there are a lot more other books in this list that I would probably recommend you read before This Is Not a Drill. The Handmaid's Tale, one of the few fiction books I read this year. oh my god, so many people have told me for so long that I need to like watch The Handmaid's Tale, but I thought I would read the book, well actually listened to the audiobook. It was so good. I haven't started on the show yet, but I will probably watch the show one day. Like, so good. Margaret Atwood, I'm probably really late to jump on this bandwagon, but like Margaret Atwood is a genius. Everything that happens in The Handmaid's Tale is basically like, she doesn't, people think that she's like crazy or like really creepy, but she's not. Like, everything that happens to these women in The Handmaid's Tale are things that have historically like happened and been recorded to different like oppressed groups of people throughout history. So she's not making anything up, she's just like taking bits from like all of these like different things throughout history and like putting them all together. A really great quote, I don't know if it was from The Handmaid's Tale or the Testaments, but it's a Margaret Atwood quote. I think it's a Margaret Atwood quote, or she just quotes it in the start of the book, but she says, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. I really like that. That really like stuck with me. I think even though it's like such an engaging and like enthralling fiction story, and like you do get so like attached to like this storyline and like these characters, like knowing that all of these things are kind of like representative of all of these other things that have happened throughout history. I don't know, it really blew my mind. Would I recommend The Handmaid's Tale? Absolutely, 100%. Maybe if you're not like into reading or you don't want to listen to the audiobook, just watch the show. How to Be a Crafitivist. I really liked this book as well. How to Be a Crafitivist, it's all about the art of gentle protest, and it kind of plays to this idea that we think, you know, when we think of protest, we think of it as like this really like disruptive, loud, aggressive, kind of like in your face thing. And I mean, by its very definition, yeah, protest is about disrupting business as usual and disrupting social norms in order to get a message heard by decision makers or by people who have power to take action and change things. But How to Be a Craftivist is all about using like crafts and the arts, and the author particularly uses like needlework and cross stitch, but it's how we can like use these kind of like less aggressive forms of art, and I guess you could even call it a form of communication, as a form of protest. If you are somebody who is involved in activism, I would definitely recommend How to Be a Craftivist. If you're interested in social change but not necessarily interested in like activism in like the traditional sense of the word, maybe read it. If you're more interested in like advocacy or humanitarianism or other forms of social change, then I probably wouldn't recommend that one. Otherwise, definitely, I loved it. Systems Thinking for Social Change. This book, I started the audiobook in 2019, didn't vibe with it. I think I started it around Christmas. Then when I went to Fiji in January this year, I was like lying on the beach and I was like, okay, well I got to keep my mind busy while I'm here. So I listened to the Systems Thinking for Social Change audiobook. It was really, really interesting. It was the first kind of introduction I've ever had to this concept of systems thinking compared to like conventional or analytical thinking. And I would definitely recommend it if you're someone working in the social change space, especially someone working in like international development, or someone interested in that. I have read a bunch of other books about systems thinking this year because I found systems thinking so profound and interesting that it's kind of the theoretical framework that I'm using for my PhD. But I definitely recommend systems thinking for social change for anybody working in the social change space, because it is quite relevant to how we can use this type of like thinking and the analytical tools associated with systems thinking to address really complex social challenges. The People versus the Tech. I read this book because one of my favorite YouTubers / booktubers, Lena Norms, recommended it, and it was really interesting. If you liked the documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma, I think it's called, I made it like a whole separate video when I was doing my daily vlogging project this year all about that documentary. If you enjoyed that, then I would also recommend The People versus the Tech. I really like how at the end of the book it's kind of got these like really practical things that you can do to address the problems associated with how technology is kind of disrupting how democracy should work, and how we're all kind of like stuck in these like echo chambers where we only engage with like content and news and information associated with like what we enjoy and what we agree with based on the way these algorithms work. So yeah, I definitely recommend The People versus the Tech. No Friend But the Mountains. This was the second time I've read this book. The first time I read it like as a physical book. This year I listened to it as an audiobook, which was really interesting because each chapter was like read by a different person. No Friend But the Mountains is it's kind of a combination of like poetry and memoir by Behrouz Boochani, who if you're Australian you're probably familiar with who he is. He is the guy who was a journalist back in, I think he's Iranian. He was a journalist, and then he was being persecuted in his country because, well, he's Kurdish actually, and he was being persecuted, so he fled to Australia, sought safety in Australia, then ended up in Manus Island, the offshore processing facility in Papua New Guinea. He had access to a mobile phone there, and he would constantly tweet and kind of keep people updated about what was happening over there. And then when all of this stuff happened, when the Australian government shut down the Manus Island detention centre, he was very outspoken about that. When people were becoming like really aware of how the refugees over there and people seeking asylum were being treated, he was like really responsible for documenting that and sharing that with the world. So yeah, an incredible guy and an incredible story. I definitely recommend reading that one, especially if you're interested in refugee rights and just human rights in general. I think it's a really good one. Factfulness. If I could make a list of the top 10 books that I read this year, Factfulness would definitely be on there. It was written by the famous, I think he's Swedish statistician, Hans Rosling. He also wrote it in partnership with, I think, his son and his son's partner, but he passed away before the book was published, which is really sad. But it's such an incredible book. It's based on this idea that, you know, as humans, we really struggle to contextualize facts and statistics. Our brains don't work that way. Like, our brains are not designed to think super logically about things in our way that we kind of like make sense of the world and understand things. We are more emotions based, we're more visual people, and we kind of think in these like cause and effect patterns, kind of like stories. That's why storytelling is such a great way to kind of influence people and help people understand things. We're simply not designed to comprehend logic and facts and statistics, and this book kind of shows us a whole bunch of different statistics and facts and things about the current state of the world, and how, because of the way we kind of understand them, the world actually isn't as bad and as fucked up as we think it is. Although obviously there are still a lot of problems, it kind of shows us how we can contextualize facts and statistics, and it was a really interesting book. I would definitely recommend Factfulness for like literally anyone, no matter what you're interested in, whether you're interested in social change or not. I thought it was a really good book, and I think more people could benefit from kind of what the book helps you understand about facts. The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. I found this book at the Lifeline Book Fest, and I grabbed it. I'd heard good things about it, so I was like, yeah, whatever. It was quite a small and easy book, so I took it with me when I was traveling around Tasmania earlier this year, and I read it in the back of the van, and I bawled my eyes out at the end of the book. Oh my gosh, I was like lying there, and Bo was lying next to me, and I was like, ah. Like, I'm such an ugly crier, and I just like started crying, and Bo was like, what's wrong? I was like, this book is so sad. But yeah, it's basically a story about this guy. He's like kind of an old guy. He doesn't really, you know, have much in life, not a lot of friends, not a lot of family. He kind of works this same job that he's been working for years, doesn't really enjoy his job, and then one day at work, in his like 80s, he dies, and he basically goes through and meets 5 people in heaven that were in some way or another a part of his life. And it was really interesting, a really interesting concept. Whether you believe in like the afterlife or not, I think you'll like it. So yeah, I definitely recommend that one as well. I don't read a lot of fiction, so for me to recommend a fiction book, like, it's good. The The next book is She Said. Such a good book. You're probably really familiar with like the whole Harvey Weinstein story. Basically, She Said is from the perspective of the two journalists that broke the news story about Harvey Weinstein and what he had done, and it basically shows what they went through from when they first kind of heard reports of what was happening to how they had to get into contact with all of these women, how difficult it was to kind of like share their stories, and you know how scared these women were to actually speak out about it. And it kind of just shows, I guess, not only like the process that journalists actually have to go through to like investigate something properly, like that kind of blew my mind, and then also it kind of just helps you understand the perspective of these women, how and like why they were so scared to come out, and how this is such like a prevalent thing in general when it comes to like victims of like sexual assault and stuff like that, and how people like Harvey Weinstein in positions of power like really do like use and abuse their power to just like stay powerful and get what they want. A really good book, and I would recommend that one probably for anyone, especially if you're a bit of a feminist, you're interested in like gender equality or just human rights in general. I would recommend She Said. Dark Emu. I had heard about this one for a while and I listened to the audiobook. It was a great book, but I wish I had read it, like a physical copy of the book. Bruce Pascoe is a great author, but his reading of the book, I really struggled to stay engaged with it. Maybe if the book is like narrated by someone else, I would listen to the audiobook narrated by someone else. I don't know, I just like, I found it really hard because like when I listen to audiobooks, it's when I'm like walking my dog or like doing some exercise or just like doing something around the house, and I found it really hard to like stay focused on his voice. But when I like, once I worked through that, it was a really good book. It's all about how Australia's Indigenous people, when Australia was like colonized, everyone came to Australia and they were like, oh, you know, this whole like idea of like terra nullius, like no man's land, and this idea that Indigenous populations were like really nomadic, when in fact they actually showed a lot of evidence that they were quite advanced when it came to like agriculture and farming and aquaculture. And just because it wasn't the same type of like farming and domestication of like farm animals and stuff like that that we saw in other parts of the world, they were still quite advanced in that sense. And so it's a really interesting book. He goes through like all of this evidence and all of these like stories throughout history to suggest that Australia's Indigenous people did in fact have these like really advanced farming systems. And it's really, really interesting. So I would recommend that one. The Testaments. I really liked The Testaments. I think, I don't know, if I had read The Handmaid's Tale many, many years ago, like when it came out, and then I'd read The Testaments now, I don't know if I would appreciate it. But I think because I read The Handmaid's Tale earlier in the year and then I read The Testaments, The Testaments like ties it all together really like nice and neatly, and I think I liked that. I think if I was someone who had like thought about like The Handmaid's Tale and had been like thinking about this and like let this thing kind of like sit in the back of my mind for so long, maybe I wouldn't like the way The Testaments like kind of tied it all together like really nicely. But I just kind of, I liked it. It would be very anxiety inducing if it had left me with like a cliffhanger like The Handmaid's Tale did. But yeah, really interesting. I mean, don't read The Testaments if you haven't read The Handmaid's Tale, but like I would recommend The Testaments if you have read The Handmaid's Tale. Maybe not if you watch the show, because the show is set earlier, like from The Handmaid's Tale. The Testaments is set like several years in the future, so maybe don't read The Testaments until the show ends. Otherwise, I don't know, it might ruin the show for you. I don't know. Get the Girls Out. Get the Girls Out is the memoir of Lucy Bloom, who I'd honestly like never heard of, but she is so cool. I read her her memoir, and as I was reading it I was like, oh my god, I can relate to this person so much. I think, I don't know, it's so refreshing as someone working in the social change space. Like, I'm a very outgoing, open person. Obviously I, you know, talk about all aspects of my life. I've kind of built a brand around you know, everything I do, including the fact that like I work in a strip club and I'm a very sex positive person, and that's not super common in like the social change space. So to read the memoir of a woman who has done some pretty badass things in her life, as well as being like the CEO of a bunch of different like charities and not-for-profits and NGOs, I don't know, I just like really vibed with it, and I really liked her. And you know, I mean, as like a cis white woman, I see myself reflected in like a lot of, you know, mainstream stories and books, but this especially, like, it was almost like looking into a mirror and like seeing like what I could be like in like, I don't know how old she is, but like 20, we'll say 20 years time. So yeah, I definitely recommend that, especially if you're someone who's a little bit like me, a little bit outgoing, a little bit open, like sex positive, all that kind of good stuff, and working in the social change space. Moment of Lift. That is the book by Melinda Gates, the wife of Bill Gates, and I was skeptical at first. I can't even remember what compelled me to download this book on Audible and listen to the audiobook, but I did, and I really enjoyed it. It was great. It kind of gives you her first-hand experience, obviously as the wife of Bill Gates, and what it's been like running the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for all these years, and all of the specific development projects that they've worked on. And it goes into a lot of detail talking about how they've really learned how to focus on projects that promote gender equality and empower women and girls, and the kind of like really interesting like flow-on effects that has in the communities that they've worked in all around the world. If you're a development practitioner or like a humanitarian, I definitely recommend that book, or someone interested in like feminism or gender equality. It was really interesting. Stop reading the news. I found this book at a bookshop and it was like on sale, so I grabbed it. I've already got a whole video on my channel that I made during COVID, when I did like I think it was like a 5 week-long daily vlogging project at the start of like isolation. I also have a whole podcast episode for the Humanitarian Changemaker Q&A podcast, where I talk about some of the concepts that were mentioned in the book. But yeah, a really interesting book. It hasn't like stopped me from reading the news, but what it does is it really points out a lot of the problems and the flaws within our kind of like 24-hour news cycle, and how like mainstream news media works. So I definitely recommend that one. We Are the Weather. Oh my gosh, I forgot I read this book. Okay, I thought in my head it was a book about a guy basically talking about why people should eat a vegan or plant-based diet to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, obviously with like the climate crisis and stuff. And I was like, well, I've been vegan for like, at the time it was 6 years, you know, I feel like I'm not going to get much out of this book, but I listened to it anyway, and I'm so glad I did. It was really, really interesting. His approach wasn't, I don't know, I thought it was just going to be like, these are the facts about the climate crisis, these are the facts about animal consumption, this is why you should stop consuming animal. But it came from such like a really personal perspective, and he was such a great storyteller. Even I felt like, as someone who has been vegan for now 7 years, and someone who cares a lot, Rocco, even I got a lot of value out of this book. So I definitely recommend it, especially if you are someone who cares about the environment, cares about the climate crisis, or even if you're already vegan, I definitely recommend that one. The Last Bush Rangers. Okay, I got this book because it was on sale at Kmart, and I didn't think I was gonna like it that much, but honestly I read it within like 3 or 4 days, and I like basically couldn't put it down. It was so fascinating. It's written by a guy who was like a 60 Minutes journalist, and he found out one day that his last name had actually been changed, and it was because his like great uncles or something were Australia's last ever bush rangers. And it was so interesting. I wasn't expecting to like it that much. I'm like not really into like history, I'm not really like into like any of that kind of stuff, but it was just so interesting. Like I couldn't stop reading it once I put it down. So I definitely recommend for any Aussies The Last Bush Rangers. Climate Justice, a feminist dot 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 is what I've written on my list. I can't remember what it's called, but it's about like a feminist response to climate change. It was a good book. It wasn't great. I think if you are going to read a book about climate change, I would probably recommend a few others, but it was interesting. It basically just goes through and it tells you all of these stories of like these incredible women from all around the world who have kind of been like leaders in the face of like natural disasters and stuff, and how empowering women is going to be a really important part of the solution to solving the climate crisis. Was it interesting? Absolutely. Would I recommend it? Not unless you're really like, if that sounds like something that appeals to you. I think for a more generalized audience, there are better books. Like the next one, The Future We Choose. The Future We Choose, I listened to the audiobook. It was really, really good. It basically talks about what the future is going to be like if we don't take action to address climate change, and it was really, really interesting. It was like the right balance of horrifying and hopeful, which I think is what you need in like climate change communication. You can't freak people out to the point where you're just like, we're doomed, we're fucked, it's the end of the world, but you also can't just like give people like hope and be like, these are all the solutions, without kind of instilling that little element of fear into them, because there is like such urgency to act now. So yeah, The Future We Choose, I definitely recommend that one. Unfree Speech, mind blown. Best, hands down, best book I've read this year. Unfree Speech is written by the leader of a political party in Hong Kong. He's my age, born in 1996. His name's Joshua. Basically, it's about how he started the whole like umbrella movement in Hong Kong. And then that's the first part of the book. Then it goes into the second part of the book where he was arrested and put into jail, and he sends all of these letters like while he's in jail, and so you read all these letters. And then the third part of the book, I can't even remember, but it's kind of about adding like current context to the issue and what it's like in Hong Kong now and what we can all do about it. And I've never sat down and read a book in one sitting. This was the first time I've ever sat down and read a book from start to finish, yeah, like at once. It was incredible. I definitely recommend it. George Orwell's 1984. So many people have told me I should read Animal Farm, and for some reason I was like, nah, I'm gonna start with 1984. It was depressing, but good. I think I preferred The Handmaid's Tale over 1984, but it was still really interesting. I actually listened to the audiobook of 1984, and the narrator was like really good. He had like this British accent, and he was like, oh, Winston, and I don't know, it was a vibe. It was a vibe. I'm gonna try and read Animal Farm in 2021, but I really did like 1984. It's worth the hype. I can see why like everyone reads 1984. How Powerful We Are, another great book. It's written by Sally Rugg, who worked for Get Up Australia, and she was one of the leaders of the campaign to like the Yes campaign for marriage equality in Australia. A great book. It goes into so much detail into what's actually involved in a campaign like that, and kind of like all of the power dynamics between like politicians and different political parties and like everyday people. It was really interesting. As someone who's been quite heavily involved in like various campaigns, I still never understood the degree to which people who are like leading a campaign like really need to like do their research, and how they need to like strategize, and all of the things that are at stake. Like when you have a campaign like the marriage equality campaign, where the goal was to get people to vote yes for marriage equality, sometimes like your messaging and the tactics that you use can be really damaging to like the LGBTQ movement overall, but sometimes that's what you have to do in order to achieve like the goal of the campaign. I recommend How Powerful We Are to like absolutely anyone, whether you're an activist or not, whether you're in social change or not. Definitely How Powerful We Are. Half the Sky. Half the Sky is a book all about basically half of the people in the world, about women and how women in various parts of the world are treated, how they're like sold into sex slavery and stuff like that. It was a lot. I couldn't read more than a chapter at a time, and even then I would like read it before bed, and I would like read a chapter and I'd be like, this is too much. I mean, like, sex trafficking and human trafficking and like the treatment of women around the world is something that we all know about, but actually like hearing firsthand stories from these women is very confronting. I would recommend it if you are interested in, I guess, like international development or politics and policy or the empowerment of women. For a more generalized audience, probably not. I mean, I don't know. You can decide if you think it would be a good fit for you. Okay, so the next few books that I read were good, but like I probably wouldn't recommend them. So the next book was An Adventurous Life. Really interesting, actually. An Australian woman who basically went like scuba diving before scuba diving was like a commercialized thing. It was something that only like the Navy did, and her partner became really famous because he built this like underwater camera device and filmed like footage of like great white sharks and different sharks for the first time. So very interesting, I guess, if you're into that. The next book was Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail. Not what I thought it was going to be, but still interesting. It kind of talks about how we rely so much on like these systems and how we think that like once systems are kind of put into place that they're just gonna like work, and then obviously big crises like Chernobyl shows us that like one tiny little glitch in a whole system can like really majorly fuck things up. It was interesting, but again, if that's something that like sounds interesting to you, then I'd recommend it. Otherwise, like, not that great. Resistance, really weird book. I listened to the audiobook, but actually maybe I do recommend it. I don't know, it was a bit like artsy for me. I actually listened to it, funnily enough, when I started getting into like painting and drawing again during like COVID, and I would just like sit outside and like listen to this book, which was about a famous singer and kind of like the stories behind her songs and why she wrote these songs and what was happening in the world at the time, and then also stories of like when she shared them with the world, and it was quite interesting. But yeah, a little bit too like artsy for me. Atomic Habits. I recommend the concept of the book Atomic Habits, but I think you could get the gist of kind of like what's behind it by just like listening to like a podcast episode about it, or like listening to an interview with the guy who wrote Atomic Habits. Like the concept of Atomic Habits, love it. Like built so many good habits during 2020 after reading that book, but I think you could kind of get like the key takeaways just from like other sources. New Earth. If you're a fan of like Eckhart Tolle, then I recommend New Earth. He's the guy who wrote The Power of Now, another really great book. But I kind of like couldn't read it all at once. I read like the first bit of it and then I like needed a break because I was like, this is too much. Then I came back to it like a few months later, read a bit more. I don't know, like it was interesting, but like I just couldn't vibe with it as like a read it all at once kind of book. But I don't know, like if you're into like that kind of like new age philosophy, then I'd recommend that one. I Built No Schools in Kenya. I'd seen this book around and I found it at a secondhand bookstore and I got it. I don't really know what I was expecting. It was like funny, I laughed, it was interesting. It's basically based on well, it is like the story of a girl, an Australian girl who went over to Kenya to kind of be like a caretaker for a really rich like British guy who was like living over there. It's funny, it's interesting, it's wacky, it's nothing like great. I don't think I would personally like recommend it unless you're just like looking for like a light casual read. Then it was pretty good. On Fire. I have to be completely honest, I did not finish this audiobook. I don't know if it was just like the audiobook or with the content of the book. Maybe I'd read too many climate change books this year and it was just like too much for my brain. But I got like a third of the way through it and I was like, I'll come back to it, and I probably will go back to it eventually. But I just like, I couldn't vibe with it. So I'd recommend maybe like one of the other climate change books that I've got in my reading list this year. Adventures in Manifesting, a book that I found at a op shop. It was interesting. I've never really been a fan of the law of attraction, but this year I started listening to like a few podcasts more just about like mindset and stuff like that, and I've kind of become like really interested in the law of attraction. So I read this book called Adventures in Manifesting, and then the next book I read was all about having a creative career, which is like kind of similar to like manifesting like your dream life in the context of working like a non-traditional creative career path. They were interesting, but yeah, very niche. If She Can, I Can, a book that my auntie gave me. It's basically just a really easy read, stories of female entrepreneurs in Australia. It was interesting, it was inspiring, but like I wouldn't recommend you go out and buy the book, but it was still interesting. Girl, Wash Your Face, couldn't finish it. Some people really vibe with Rachel Hollis. I don't know. I wanted to like it because I've listened to Rachel Hollis on like a bunch of podcasts and stuff, but I listened to the audiobook and I got like 4 or 5 chapters in and I was like, it's not for me. I don't know. I just like, I didn't vibe with it. You Are a Badass at Making Money. Whew. My god, so many people have told me to like read this book or listen to this book. My business coach, because I'm doing a group coaching program at the moment, she was like, yes, if you have like a negative money mindset, listen to You Are a Badass at Making Money. Oh, such a good book. I recommend it to like any female, no matter what type of like job you work in, no matter what industry you work in. It'll really kind of like shift any like negative money mindsets that you have and change any like preconceived ideas that you have about money and money being bad or wanting money as being a bad thing. Yeah, I definitely recommend that one. Golden Age Politics. Golden Age Politics was an interesting book that the author of the book actually sent me because she found me on Instagram and thought I'd be interested. I've read about half of it and it's on my iPad, and I kind of like read it when I'm like at the beach or something and I don't have like a book on me, but I haven't finished it. It's somewhat interesting. It's kind of all about what the new wave of like leaders in the world and politicians are going to be like, and it's kind of talking about women and vegan women and stuff like that. So it's a really interesting, I guess, take on the new like generation of leaders and politicians and stuff. Who knows, maybe I'll be one day. Thinking in Systems and The Fifth Discipline, 2 books that I listened to as audiobooks just to kind of get my head around this idea of systems thinking, particularly because I'd read systems thinking for social change, and then I knew I wanted to use systems thinking as kind of like a theoretical framework for my PhD. So before I read like any academic literature or academic books about it, I decided to listen to those kind of like really key audiobooks. All about what systems thinking is, to kind of just wrap my head around it. And if you are interested in systems thinking, I definitely recommend both of those as well. My Tidda, My Sister. Marley Silver is like an incredible woman in, I think she lives in New South Wales. She has done so many amazing things. She's the co-founder of Tiddas for Tiddas, which is like an online platform to empower young Indigenous women and kind of showcase all of the amazing things that young Indigenous women are doing all around Australia. She wrote her first book, My Tidda, My Sister. I didn't really know what to expect from it, but it was like one of those books where like once you kind of start, you just can't put it down. It's quite an easy read. The actual like experience of reading the book, because the whole book is filled with this like incredible artwork to kind of like go with it, just like reading the book is like such like an experience in itself. I really enjoyed it. So I recommend that one, or I recommend that one as like a really good gift if you have like young women or young Indigenous females in your life. Great book, definitely recommend it. The next one I read was the LSP method, the Lego Serious Play method. I want to make a whole video about Lego Serious Play and what it actually is and how I'm incorporating it into the work that I do. But I have always wanted to get qualified in Lego Serious Play, and a guy that someone recommended do like my training released a book all about the Lego Serious Play method. So I've read that book, love it. Love Lego Serious Play. I'm gonna make a whole nother video on it. Letters That Changed the World. Another one that my auntie got me from an op shop. It it's actually really interesting. There's like all of these letters, all about like, they're kind of separated into different categories like love, and stuff like that. And yeah, it's really interesting. Letters, even just like the first, like the introduction of the book, talking about like what letters represented in their time. Like today, nobody writes anyone letters. We have emails, we have, you know, all of these other forms of communication. But like throughout history, letters were like the form of communication, which is kind of crazy to think that they've only like kind of become like less relevant in like, you know, the last like 50 years or so. But yeah, it just basically has a whole bunch of different like letters from throughout history that like different kings and queens sent to each other, celebrities sent to each other, like important figures throughout history sent each other. And it was really interesting. I really liked that book. More Than Honey was another book my auntie got me from an op shop. It is about, I guess, bees and the plight of the global bee population. It was a lot. It was like a very informative book, and apparently there is a documentary of the same name, which I haven't seen. But if you're interested in learning about the bees, I'd probably say go and watch the documentary. It'd probably be a bit more engaging and informative than I found the book. Second last book that I read this year, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. Honestly, would be in my top 10 if I had a top 10 list of books from this year. It never occurred to me until I read this book that, you know, we think science is the answer to the climate crisis, because, you know, science explains things, it helps us understand things, it's the evidence that these things exist, but it's people that are going to make change, and science won't change people. Communication will change people. The humanities and the arts and the social sciences are what change people, and so in those disciplines lies the solution to the climate crisis. And basically the book is just how we can begin to talk about and communicate climate change in a more effective way. And it was so interesting. I definitely recommend that one. Probably my top climate change book for 2020. And finally, the last book I have just finished reading as an audiobook is Designer Relationships. I've always been interested in non-monogamous relationships. I have had non-monogamous relationships in the past, and I just kind of wanted to like learn more about it, and someone recommended this book called Designer Relationships. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, then I would definitely recommend the book. If monogamy is for you, or you're not really interested in learning about non-monogamous relationships or polyamorous relationships, or as the authors call them, designer relationships, then there's probably no need for you to read that book. But that is the list of all 44 books that I read in 2020. I hope you will be able to add a few of them to your reading list if they sound like something that you would be interested in. I would love to hear what books you read this year and what books you recommend. Definitely let me know down below, because I'm currently creating my TBR list for 2021 and looking at what books I want to buy and which ones I want to listen to as an audiobook and stuff like that. So I would love to hear what you read. Other than that, this is a really long video, so thank you for sticking all the way through to the end. I will definitely see you guys next year in 2021. I will hopefully be making more videos for you. Let me know what you guys want to see from me in 2021. I had a lot of fun doing my daily vlogging project until it just got too much with my PhD. But yeah, I'll definitely be making more videos for you guys next year.